Square Ball Podcast.
Hello there. Welcome to the show. The View from the Press Box here with Phil Hay from The Athletic. Dan here from the Square Ball. The show is brought to you by West Yorkshire Electrical. wyelectrical.co.uk for details. They're also on socials. Specialists in all things electrical, fully accredited. If it's got wires in it, they will work with it, including solar panel installation, battery storage, EV chargers, as well as they are specialists in renewables. School contracting, CCTV, security alarms, you name it, they do it. Full details on the website, wyelectrical.co.uk for details. Phil, hello. Usual Monday get-together, you and I, and a fairly pleasant one, I think, this week, because we went and absolutely roasted Cardiff at the weekend. So how was it for you? How was your journey? I'm interested in finding out, because it's a right old trek down to South Wales.
Yeah, good and proper roasting. I would say that's the best trip I've ever had to Cardiff. I mean, the levels of competition for that are fairly low, because we had some really miserable trips down to Wales. But no, the drive was nice and steady, motorway there and back, clear roads. I'm pleased you're concerned about my logistical movements. It was just all-round top performance from Leeds. It's strange with Cardiff. I watched them on the first day of the season at Ellen Road, and I know they were within a few seconds of winning that game, but I thought they were incredibly limited. And my initial impression of them on that day was that they were likely to be in trouble this season. And you had exactly the same impression from the game on Saturday. That was a very unhappy home crowd, and I totally understood that. And you came away afterwards trying to decide whether Leeds, who had been excellent, had made them look particularly bad, or whether they were just actually as bad as they seemed and as limited as they seemed. And I suspect it was a little bit of both. And it's quite a surprise to see them where they are in the division and to think that they are virtually safe, because they look like a side who could have been swimming around the plug hole this season on the basis of what we've seen of them in the flesh. But Leeds were never in trouble. And I think the big thing for me on Saturday was that they avoided the pitfalls of previous away games and the failings of the games that they had lost, like West Brom and Preston, Stoke and Sunderland and others, in that they got ahead early on, which meant that Cardiff's really low block was apparently obsolete, although Cardiff seemed compelled to kind of stick with it all the way through the game, which was very strange. But then a second goal which really turned the screw and meant that, in the second half, it was really about game management more than anything else. It should have been more than three. It could easily have been more than three. The luxury of being able to miss that penalty. But I think, I was listening to Farker afterwards saying that was probably the most mature performance of the season. And I think that's right. And certainly away from home, it was very controlled. And I have to say as well, I think probably the sort of result and performance that was needed after some of what had gone on during the week.
And how much of the change in tack that we saw there in the away game, taking an away game by the scruff of the neck rather than being a little bit passive or awkward, or however it is you might want to describe some of our more recent away performances, how much of that do you put down to Patrick Bamford, who's quick becoming like Renaissance man, isn't he?
Yeah, I think he's having a big influence. I think that there's a definite difference being made by him at 9. His runs in behind, his movement on Saturday was really difficult to manage in the way that it was against Birmingham as well. And it did feed into one of the pieces that I did last week, which was saying that when Bamford does get going, he does tend to get on a bit of a roll, and that's 3 goals in 3 for him. I think you would say that the finish on Saturday was very much the yin to the yang of that Puskas Award winner away at Peterborough. But it was still born of a lot of what Leeds do well. Ruter's passing to Somerville trying to go beyond the last man into kind of deep positions near the byline where he can cause havoc. The pace was killing Cardiff. Cardiff didn't seem to know how to manage it. And what I found really strange with them was that they didn't seem to have much in the way of tactical adjustment after they went 1-0 down. The low block was still there, and that, I think, is why the home crowd were getting so tetchy towards the end of the first half, because it felt as if they were inviting Leeds on at a point when they were already 2-0 down. So I do think Bamford is making a big difference. I think Gruev had his best game in the centre of midfield by a distance. Probably a good game for him to settle into, because Cardiff were not great and they were pretty passive themselves. But we haven't seen a huge amount of Gruev this season. I do always think with him that he's someone who's come from the Bundesliga, someone who's played at a pretty high level with Werder Bremen. You did think in the Championship that even though he'd have to adapt to a different style and I guess a different level of intensity, and the Championship's pretty unique in the way that football is played out in it, you thought that he should be a really big asset. And I think playing like that, he definitely is.
Yeah, what was the crowd like overall? Home fans, away fans, presumably the away fans in good voice on a day that was there to be enjoyed, I think. Because I bumped into a pal of mine, guy called Peter, on Friday. He was going down with his lad, and they were getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning or whatever. The coach was setting off at 6, and we were sort of exchanging the usual idea that it's a long way back from Cardiff when you lose. And I remember very, very starkly what it was like losing that playoff final and waiting for the train afterwards, just slumped on the platform thinking, oh, it's 5 hours back to Leeds now.
With the rain hammering off the roof. And the away end was, as you'd expect, it was quite a big home crowd on Saturday. And I think it was a classic example of a game where there's nothing for the home crowd to invest in at all. I think they were... I think the realists among the Cardiff support will have seen and noticed that Cardiff were outmatched and that Leeds' superior quality was definitely telling. But I definitely think that there were ways in which they could have been more aggressive, ways in which they could have mixed it up more. They didn't ever really look like scoring. There were just a couple of moments at 2-0 down in that kind of critical period, 75 minutes to 85 minutes, where they had the odd chance. And if a goal goes in at that point, you suddenly fear that you're going to get that scrambled finish in which what should be an easily banked win turns into a kind of ludicrous draw. But it didn't ever feel like it was going that way. And I think Leeds' presence of mind to finish it off, even after Somerville missed the penalty, made it something pretty close to the complete performance, I thought. I did think it was really, really good. And I don't know, it was a difficult week for Farke because he had Ayling leaving. And, my understanding with Ayling is that he, even a couple of weeks back, he was minded to stay and to see this season out. But I think in the absence of a new contract coming his way, and particularly the absence of any significant minutes at Peterborough, I think he just found himself asking what role he was actually playing, other than kind of that of a cheerleader. So the request to go to Middlesbrough after the Peterborough game really, really stemmed from that. But you had the issue with Charlie Creswell also, and Farke has taken a hard line on that, and then he does seem like a disciplinarian in these scenarios. But it's hard for me to see a way in which this doesn't end with Creswell leaving. You feel as if you've seen this dance before, and in the circumstances, the vibes you're getting are that Creswell definitely wants to go, and that if there was the right offer or a suitable offer, then Leeds would let him. The difficulty is that a huge amount of the interest in him is coming from the Championship, and you have to be strategic when it comes to letting players go elsewhere and thinking about what they might do that might compromise your own season. And seems evident that Leeds would not want him to go to another club who were in the mix with them in the Championship. But when you have weeks like that, and when you're making big decisions that some people will agree with, some people will disagree with, when it's kind of, major stuff, it does seem pretty important to me that in the game that follows, the weekend that follows, you perform and you play in a way and you deliver a result, at the same time. It kind of indicates a lot of what's been going on. I mean, if I think back, sort of comparable situation almost, and not identical, but which springs to mind was the defeat to Sutton United under Gary Monk, when played really poorly, picked a very, very odd team, which seemed like a very much kind of two fingers to the board, who hadn't really delivered players in the transfer market at that point. Some odd comments afterwards about the transfer market. And we went to Blackburn midweek, the following week, and Leeds nicked that game right at the very end, and you could really sense some relief with Monk, and that kind of feeling that after what had happened at Sutton and after everything that was being said and the narrative around it, that it was important to look like you were still in control and important to look like you were still kind of careering in the right direction. And I think that was very much the message from Saturday. If there was concern or angst or doubt about Ayling and Creswell prior to it, I think it was one of those games that made it feel as if Farke knows what he's doing.
Yeah, particularly in relation to Luke Ayling, there's an interesting counterpoint, isn't there, between the fact that it was described as the most mature performance we've seen this season, and it's hard to disagree with that. I would tend to agree with that.
Yes.
At the moment when one of the senior statesmen in the dressing room has moved on, and you highlight this point in your match report, so I will defer to you on this one.
Yeah, I was looking back at the squad in 1920, the last time Leeds went up, and it wasn't as if in that era Bielsa banked wholly on experience. I was thinking about somebody like Neil Warnock, whose promotions over the years have, very often been built on players who've been there and done it. Leeds on occasions could have exceptionally young bench. And it was always Bielsa's attitude that if there were players from the academy who could fill gaps or slots in his squad, then that's what should happen rather than recruitment externally, and older, kind of more proven players coming in. But even so, there was a really mature core in that dressing room, Cooper, Dallas, Ayling, Cleek, even guys like Berardi. And I know Berardi could be hot-headed on the pitch, but he was an absolute stickler for discipline off the pitch, and a very, very good, healthy presence in the dressing room. It's different now, and it's going to be different this season, and it's going to be done differently because there is a much heavier weight on younger players and much heavier weight on youth producing what older players produced back then. And I guess it remains to be seen whether there comes a stage this season, because Parker knows that as you get down to the sharp end, the pressure hikes up, it gets more intense. So it remains to be seen whether or not there comes a period where they are missing people like Ayling, they are missing that sort of influence, those sort of older heads that keep everybody level and keep the equilibrium steadier. I think, though, another point to make is that back in that season, 1920, a lot of the older players were playing. The older heads were involved and heavily involved. That isn't the case now. Ayling has had very few minutes, certainly since things fell into place at the end of August. It's been kind of drift towards the fringes of the squad. Cooper is more involved, but is simply not playing much. Is not really at the forefront of this. And in those circumstances, I guess the influence that they can have becomes different because there'll be personal frustration about how little they're in the team. And as I said in a previous podcast, players like Ayling don't want to be cheerleaders. They don't want to be babysitters. I think he understood the role he could play as a kind of senior head in the squad. But I think from his point of view, that had to involve minutes from time to time.
It's interesting to draw a comparison with last season. And this season, it feels like Leeds are perhaps putting together or have put together the nucleus of a new core to this side. And I'm thinking in particular Ethan Ampadu, still a very young man, but quite a seasoned pro for a young man, isn't he? And he's wearing the captain's armband at the weekend. Look back to last season, and eventually the figures that became prominent in that squad were the same ones who got us promoted, wasn't it? It was Cooper. I know Dallas, has obviously been injured and so on, but that same core of players were still kind of trying to pull the club up by its bootstraps, if you like, and the players that they brought in, many of which have gone out or were supplemented into the squad post-promotion, never really formed a core group, did they? Never exerted much influence either on the pitch or off it, I suppose it looks like. And you were left with a sort of a core of young players as well. And I'm thinking this is how Willie Nonto came to prominence last season and his burst of form. Still a very young man. He was a teenager at this point. So you had the kind of old guard that was sort of peripheral and in the process of being replaced. The young players sort of picking up the slack at the bottom end and then not a right lot in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to pretend that the squad doesn't have any experience in it. And you had Bamford starting up front, and now back into a little bit of form. But again, similar to the kind of involvement of Cooper and Ayling, it's taken until January for that to happen, and that is partly down to injury. But I think early in the season, Rutter and Pirro had kind of established the pecking order, and were very much Farke's first picks in those positions. They've set themselves up nicely this season. I think they've given themselves a proper chance by doing what they've done in the transfer market. The division is not helping because of the way it is, and it was a really, really big win for Ipswich against Sunderland. I felt, that was a result they really needed. But that's Leeds past 50 points now, with 27 games gone and 19 to go. So I think where they would have envisaged being when the season started. You're right about them creating a new crop, and some really good, top level championship players in there in Rodon and Ampadu and others. The weird thing, and this is a much broader point, and we have touched on it before, is even though you try to create this new core and this new kind of group that can develop and grow and get older, the problem in front of you is that if it works out and it goes to plan, you then have that massive bridge to cross, which is the Championship to the Premier League, which asks a huge amount of players, does expose those who aren't quite good enough in the Premier League, and for certain clubs, forces a fairly major overhaul of the squad. And I think if Leeds do go up, it's quite sad to say this, but they're going to have to make tough decisions about some players who've done a great job for them in the Championship, but then decide whether they're right for the Premier League. And I think anybody who goes up this season, I think this applies to Leicester, Southampton as well, will have to recruit heavily to make sure that they're okay for the Premier League.
Yeah, it's what Angus Kinnear has said to us before when he's come in and spoken to us before the start of each season, is that actually the difficulty in those first 3 seasons, and it's why he's always highlighted the fact that there's a high statistical chance of you going down inside your first 3 seasons, is because you just cannot evolve the squad fast enough. It's you just physically cannot spend the money. It's quite hard to do, short of coming up and chucking, I don't know, half a bill at it or something like that. So it's a tough one, isn't it? And then you get players who get promoted on high wages who you then struggle to offload back down to the Championship because of the wages. But it's one of those problems, I guess, we've got to worry about when we're further down the line. I think we caught ourselves doing this last week, didn't we? Talking about like the next step in the road. But I'm just interested in us getting promoted this season if it's all the same to you. And I'm quite, do you know what? I'm quite enjoying myself still. I'm not letting the nerves creep in. I think it helps having a game like that one at the weekend, because my wife was nice enough to buy me an Apple Watch for Christmas. God bless her. Just another thing to play with to keep you quiet, I think. And I'd looked at my heart rate for that game because I'm just curious, because it's one of the new ones, it tracks it. Never rose above 76 at the weekend, Phil, which tells you a lot about that game, doesn't it?
Do you know what I got for Christmas from my wife?
Go on.
An Iron Brew clock.
Right.
It's ace, actually.
Yeah.
Love it. But it wasn't an Apple Watch. I'll put it that way. But similar theme. I suspect slightly less cost.
It was classic. Let's not get each other anything territory, and then she gets me that.
And then she gets you an Apple Watch, but you've kind of followed the rules. Yeah, good on you. Rules are rules. Stick for them. Yeah,
spoken like a true Scotsman.
Absolutely. Yeah. I came away from Cardiff as well thinking, and irrespective of what we've just said about, the jump from the Championship to the Premier League and whether who will be good enough for that. There've been a lot of high performing players in this Leeds squad this season, particularly those who've played really regularly. I mean, I didn't think Somerville had his best day at all on Saturday, but still those moments where he's such a handful that he's really difficult to manage, and defences start to panic when he's getting in behind. Rutter, I think the combination of Rutter and Bamford looks really good. And I do wonder whether it is starting to bring the best out of Rutter when it comes to passing and pulling the strings at 10. But Ampadu, I mean, again, a good game for this to have Ampadu and Rodon at centre-back, because they weren't under a huge amount of pressure. But they didn't let themselves come under a huge amount of pressure. And Ampadu just seems to manage things well, whether he's 10, 15 yards in front of the defence or whether he's at centre-back. And I think, again, for £7 million, somebody who's able to slot into either position so well is great value. Really, really good signing, that one. And probably at this stage, the signing of the summer, even allowing for the fact that, Byram on a free transfer has been really good value as well.
Just on Somerville, I made that exact point on the match ball when we did that on the live stream at the weekend, sort of saying it wasn't his best day, was it? I mean, he was only involved in the 2 goals, and he missed the penalty, but he was not quite, he wasn't his usual high self, was he? I think he's one of our highest scoring players statistically. Like if you look at FotMob or whatever, he's averaging really high for the season. So maybe it was a 7 out of 10 rather than an 8 or a 9. But even still, if those are the bad days, as I said on the match ball stream, if those are the bad days and you still come out winning 3-0 at an absolute canter, you can't really complain too much, can you? It's all gravy.
Well, that's it. But you cannot pretend that he didn't make a difference in those. I know the kind of assists go to him, but it's the perseverance, isn't it? And it's the trickery, and it's the kind of click of the fingers chaos that makes defenders think, wait a minute, we don't know what to do here. And everybody starts to panic. People get out of position. And what you find is you've got Bamford, who, even though he's lying on the ground, is just free to prod that in. Another goal for Dan James as well. I think one of my favourite parts of Saturday's game was trying to work out how it was that James came out of that challenge with the ball for the third goal. Yeah. It seemed as if he was going to get killed by about 3 people, and then all of a sudden was just careering away into the Cardiff half, having
It's glorious watching it back, Phil. I've watched that on replay, along with the rest of the highlights, a number of times now, and you see it happening, don't you? The 3 of them all converging on this one spot on the pitch, and you go, God, can you nick that away? Oh, he's going to get there. And then they both panic to the defenders and just clatter into each other. It's an absolute work of art.
It was like Welsh rugby, really, where, you got a winger who's about to get absolutely smashed by 3 people, but somehow slips out of it. And I don't think even James knew quite how the ball had come out of that. But again, in that position, Leeds have so much pace going forward that as soon as you're exposed like that, you're in huge trouble. And that was a quality goal, actually. It was a lovely step over from Bamford and a really good finish from Rutter, who I think, definitely needs goals just to keep him ticking over. He's doing a lot right. And I think if he was bang on it, would have scored more than he has this season. But he's been a big influence from the start, Rutter, and I think in the story of this season will be absolutely crucial at the end of it too.
He's just great fun. I absolutely adore watching him. As a young man having the time of his life, I look on it with it's a weird like paternal pride, if you like, where he's just having such a nice time. And even in the celebration, having the presence of mind to do that for Luke Ayling, it feels like he's really, I don't know, immersed himself in what makes the fans tick in relation to the club.
I think the awful thing about last season, particularly from the sort of Somerville winner at Liverpool onwards, was that so few people seem to be enjoying it in any way. And you can see that in the players' body language. And the thing that always jumps to mind is sitting in the press box, watching them in front of that away end at Bournemouth with no idea of what to do, not really wanting to be there because you're horribly exposed and it's all going wrong. And it is nice to see a bit of joy in the football. I think there has been plenty this season. I think a lot has been right this season. It's not been perfect, and definitely aspects of it that you can pick fault with and pick holes in, and that was certainly the case away from home prior to the turn of the year. But that performance on Saturday, and I think you do have to factor in how poor and limited Cardiff looked. But even so, that performance on Saturday felt as if it had addressed some of what had gone on in previous away games. And it did seem as if there was a concerted effort to do it differently. And as soon as the first goal went in, you did think to yourself, well, this changes it significantly because Cardiff are going to have to commit now, which Cardiff never really did. And I think that, more than anything, rather than the defeat itself, was why the home crowd were so unhappy about it.
Just returning to an earlier point, Phil, we were talking about the almost seemingly inevitable departure of Charlie Creswell at this stage. You get the sense now that there's a little bit of momentum starting to build in terms of Leeds doing something in the market, because we're now middle of the month, 2 weeks left to get stuff done. It feels like there's a little bit of a head of steam, perhaps just building up.
I'd be really surprised if they don't. And given the situation Creswell's in, I see no alternative but to find another centre-back or to find another player, whether it's a full-back who can play at centre-back, something that covers that gap. Because it was very, very explicit on Thursday when we sat in with Farker, and he does do this from time to time, but the Creswell question had almost become a little bit like the Joel Pirro at 10 question, where it was getting asked and it was in the background and, everybody was kind of thinking about it. It wasn't, front and centre necessarily, but there always was that thing of, what is happening with Creswell, particularly after he didn't feature at Peterborough. And it seemed like on Thursday, Farker had just decided to himself, right, I'm gonna lay this out and I'm gonna tell you exactly how it is, and then you all know, and we go from there. And the bottom line is that for the foreseeable future, Creswell is not going to be. Not only is he not going to play, he's not going to be involved. And in those circumstances, said you can't feel like you've seen this dance before. That he, he's likely to go. That is how these situations usually end. And it did seem as well, like Farker was saying, in order for this to turn around, Creswell is going to have to come to him and basically say, I'm going to 100% knuckle down. Because the thing that Farker was taking most issue with wasn't his professionalism in terms of timing, turning up when he should turn up, which was an issue with Jed Spence. He basically said, when we are travelling away from home or around about games, I see in his body language, a quite deflated character, somebody who isn't focused, somebody who is pretty frustrated about what's going on. And I think almost that thing of does he really want to be here and does he really want to be involved? And clearly Farker's view on that is that at the moment, no, he doesn't. So this isn't going to resolve itself. There's going to have to be a decision taken one way or the other. But Farker is adamant on having 4 centre-backs in the squad. So if Creswell isn't involved, that leaves room for another one. And I think at right back, there was never the plan this month for both Spence and Ayling to go. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, you would have assumed that both would have stayed. But circumstances have dictated that. And in a way, you almost feel like right back has become as important as left back because of what's happened in the past fortnight. But it seems pretty obvious to me where the main focus needs to be. And while I can certainly see scope and merit in looking for somebody in attacking midfield area, another kind of 10. I think the most prudent thing to do, if Leeds are going to do anything, is to strengthen what's at the back.
The number 10 thing has almost resolved itself with Bamford returning to form up front, hasn't it? And Rutte being able to drop in behind him. That said, if there's an opportunity to do something, I'd like us to do it. But yeah, I agree that the more pressing issue is definitely at the back, isn't it? And I was just going to ask you, actually, it's something you touched on a little bit earlier in the show. For such a softly spoken character, Daniel Farke doesn't take much shit, does he? He always puts the interests of the club absolutely at the top.
Well, I think this is the point that he was trying to make about both Ayling and Creswell, was that he wasn't minded to make decisions on the basis of what they wanted personally. I think with Ayling, you have to say that asking him to stick around in a sort of cheerleader role, kind of, parental role, if you want to put it like that, is maybe asking a bit too much of him. If you aren't going to play him and you aren't going to use him at Peterborough, I think you probably have to face facts and say, if he's looking to go elsewhere, then we need to facilitate that, because otherwise, what are you asking of him? You're basically asking him to burn 6 months of a career where he's already 32 and getting into the back end of it. Creswell, I think, is different, and that seems to me to be, it's like a classic age-old battle, isn't it, of player and manager who's in charge. And managers who aren't in charge never last long. They simply don't. I mean, if you ever talk to Brian McDermott about the back end of his time as manager, when he'd been sacked and then reinstated, and the players knew he'd been sacked and reinstated, and those who weren't keen on him or those who weren't big on him, became less and less helpful, became kind of less and less committed in the dressing room. He always says he could feel that and he could sense it, but there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He just knew that in the end, he was likely to get sacked by Cellino anyway, and was, but in the end, it was going to cost him. Because you start to lose control. You used to see it with Ferguson at Manchester United. You see it with Guardiola at Manchester City. Will take what look like fairly controversial decisions when they think it's in their interest to do that, even if it costs them some pretty good players in the process. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we saw it with Nonto in the summer too. It was exactly the same thing of, you're not going to train with us, you're not going to play until you make a decision one way or the other. And I think that kind of set the tone. And between Spence and Creswell in particular, I think Ayling's slightly different. He goes with everybody's good wishes. But between Spence and Creswell, you kind of seeing who's in charge and who runs the show.
Just made me wonder, particularly because he's been flapping his gums a lot this week, Jesse Marsh, whether he had full control over that dressing room or whether he's trying to be pals with them all last season. But I suppose it's not even our problem anymore, is it?
No, not especially. I mean, I don't think in any way, certainly towards the end of the season, you didn't feel as if it was a dressing room that was blessed with great leadership or great resilience either. And I think that is different now. It's a fine balance, because you have to be careful not to upset players at the same time. And I don't mean individuals, I mean players en masse. And players en masse at a club like Leeds and in a dressing room like this one at the moment would want to see somebody like Ayling in particular managed properly and managed fairly and managed appropriately and looked after on the basis of 7.5 years of really, really, top service. It's different with somebody like Spence, for example, and I guess it's different with somebody like Creswell. As soon as it looks like you're making allowances, or as soon as it looks like you're weakening slightly in terms of discipline or authority, it can cause you problems very quickly.
Have you been enjoying Jesse's podcast appearances lately, Phil?
I had a good listen to the Simon Jordan one. Went all the way through. I would say there was some things in it I disagreed with. Mm-hmm. But we've kind of been over this ground many times, haven't we?
What was it that you disagreed with?
I think the point in particular that jumped out was the argument about games in hand when they were 17th and XG and everything else. And if you're being totally fair, you would say that there were points in the season where the stats or the data certainly indicated that Leeds should have had more points than they actually did, or should have been in a better league position than they actually were. But there were also stats that pointed to huge problems, and one of them, we dug it out for our end-of-year review.
Is it that we kept losing?
Well, keeping losing wasn't particularly good, but it was the number of big chances that were given away. Defensively, they were just not there, and they were not sound as a team. And I think I'm very much a believer in data, and I understand the role it plays, and I understand the difference it makes and why you have to pay attention to it. But there always comes a point, doesn't there, where where what is happening on the grass and the actual results outweigh what you're seeing in the data.
Well, on the grass, it's Preston at the weekend, so we'll get back together towards the end of the week then, shall we? And we will preview that. We will be ahead of the press conference just for timing reasons, so we won't be able to follow up on what Farke said at the end of the week. But at least it's a shorter journey, albeit it's a stupid early kickoff on a Sunday.
Yeah, it's not great, is it? I mean, I think Leeds more often than not now are going to find a lot of fixtures move because we're hitting that point of the season where Sky are going to want to televise the games that really matter. But it's a winnable game. I think it'll be a very different game to the game at Deepdale. And again, frustration over the weekend is that just as Ipswich have been out of form and Leeds put that performance in at Cardiff, Ipswich come up with that victory over Sunderland in a really good game, actually. I watched the first half before getting back in the car. It was proper entertaining. But that's a big result for them.
It is, but I'm looking ahead to next Monday night, and we can chat about this towards the back end of the week. But Monday, the 22nd of January, 8 o'clock kickoff, Leicester City against Ipswich Town. That's fascinating.
Very much so. Very much so.
Right, I'll speak to you later in the week, Phil. All right.
Thanks, Dan.
The Square Ball Podcast.